Good morning to each of you as we continue our study in the book of Revelation. I hope to wrap up chapter 6 today and also finish chapter 7 if at all possible. So just as a reminder of where we are, remember we're opening the seven seals. Jesus has been highlighted, exalted as the one worthy to actually open the seals. We looked at the first four, that was the four horsemen last time. And then we looked at the fifth seal, which was the souls under the altar. And then we begin looking at the sixth seal, and we have a description here that looks like it's the end of the world. So just for review, I'm going to read this. He says, I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? All right, so we asked last time, and you all answered this, but I didn't get a chance to go through my answer to this. So, is this the end of the world? It sure sounds like the end of the world. If it's not the end of the world, what could it possibly be? And what would the end of the world look like? So, as Caleb Boss mentioned last time, there's some things that don't make sense if this is going to be the end of the world because of the people being there asking for the mountains and rocks to fall on them. And I think Caleb also mentioned the corresponding passages in the Old Testament prophecies and how they relate to this. So this is very, very common language that's found throughout the Old Testament. And all of the prophets, especially Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, those three deal with not just the destruction of maybe Israel, but Judah and Jerusalem, but they also deal with the destruction of a lot of the surrounding nations. So one of the things that was a key point of emphasis in those is that God is the God not just of Israel, not just of Judah and Jerusalem, but he's the God ultimately over all of these nations, and he's going to judge the whole world. And so all the nations that surrounded Israel and that were the ones that came into their picture as captors, as people overthrowing them and bringing in judgment, God made special point to focus on each one of them as well, to show that even though they're being used as a tool to overthrow God's people who have rejected him, God's also the God over these other people, even Greece and Rome, as he would go on to say in some of the prophets. All right, so Isaiah 13, 1 to 19. Look, the burden against Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos saw. Then he goes on to talk about the day of the Lord being at hand, and the reaction being it will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will be limp, every man's heart will melt. Behold, the day of the Lord comes, cruel with both wrath and fierce anger, to lay the land desolate, and he will destroy its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not give their light. The sun will be darkened in its going forth, and the moon will not cause its light to shine. He goes on to say, Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth will move out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts, and in the day of his fierce anger. Behold, I will stir up the Medes against them, who will not regard silver, and as for gold, they will not delight in it. And Babylon, the glory of kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldeans' pride, will be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So it's the exact same language, almost verbatim, for what we found in the book of Revelation. But here we see it being applied to Babylon's destruction, and he doesn't shift to the end of the world. We're still talking about Babylon even when we finish this, and the Medes are going to be the ones that are going to be the tool of destruction here. So in Isaiah 29 and then Jeremiah 4 and Matthew 24, we find very similar language, again being used for the destruction of Jerusalem. Of course, Matthew 24 is looking forward to the destruction of Rome. Jeremiah 4, 23 to 28 is of particular notice because he uses the exact same language where he's saying, I'm going to make the earth look like it was before it was created, when it was without form and void. And he says, but I'm not going to make a full end of it. that is language that says it's going to be completely wiped out, but he specifically says, but I won't make a full end. I'm going to leave some behind. So that makes it very clear, even within that one context, this is figurative language. This is hyperbole. It is going to be an awesome destruction, but it's not really talking about the end of the world. Joel 2:31 is also helpful because it also uses the same language. But then we have divine commentary in Acts 2 where Peter, through the Holy Spirit, says this is the fulfillment of what Joel prophesied about how the sun would be turned to blood and I think the moon darkened. I forget the exact language there. But did those things happen? Did the sun and the moon turn dark, be filled with blood? No. What were those references to? So I think those are references to the failure of the leadership in those cases. But let's talk about this for a little bit. So let's talk about the stars. So I think one of the best explanations for what the stars are, I mean, all of these symbols, they have some root, they have some stem, in some way that God originally set these up. There was some way that he used these in the beginning, and it's from that we draw our understanding of that. So I think the idea of the stars being the rulers goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Remember where he talked about that he would set up a greater light, a lesser light, the sun and the moon, and then he would set up the stars to rule the day and to rule the night. They would be for times and for seasons. And by that, we would have direction. So there's all of the expressions that we've been using about kings who are associated with the times and the seasons, and then also the rule as well. So I think you have the idea of not only the stars, but also the sun and the moon be associated with various forms of rulers. But Numbers 24:17, when Balaam prophesies, he talks about David and Messiah being a star. And then in Isaiah 14:12, there he uses a star for actually Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Well, it may not be Nebuchadnezzar at that point, but it is the king of Babylon. And then in Daniel 8:10, it's also used for Antiochus Epiphanes, who would be a star. He would actually grow up and exalt himself to the point that he would knock stars down. So it seems that stars are a representation of rulers, actually all the lights. So the idea being that the lights are rolled up and carried away. We see that same language in Isaiah 34. All the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled up like a scroll, and their hosts shall fall down. And is this the end of the world? No. Indeed, it shall come down on Edom and on the people of my curse for judgment. So, again, end of the world language, but he specifically applies it to Edom. And the idea being that, again, all of their leaders and even their people would be rolled up and carried away and be no more. So we've talked about mountains before. So when you think of mountains being used as a symbol, what passages come to mind? Isaiah 2, Micah 4, that God's mountain would be exalted above all the other mountains when the kingdom is established. I think that's probably one of the clearest usages of that. But even go back through the conquering of the promised land, the mountains are the capital cities. Those are the fortresses, the strongholds of power. And then we could think of it also as the mountains being the most permanent things. So if the most permanent things, the unshakable things are being shaken, then that's also of special significance. So the idea of the islands and the remote lands, when God is foretelling the doom of Tyre, this is something that he uses, that the coastlands, the islands, the inhabitant of the isles would all be astonished and all be concerned. This is something that we see over and over again to refer to people that are not in the immediate vicinity, but are still connected and would be affected, and they would be very upset by the things that are happening there as well. So the idea of men hiding and asking for rocks to cover them, Hosea 10:6-8, it's the exact same language there. Notice, when Assyria comes in and Israel is destroyed and Samaria is cut off, he says, they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So again, exact same language, but used for the destruction of Israel before Assyria. But this is also used in Isaiah 2 when God foretells or says, warns Jerusalem that Assyria might come and take them away. And then in Luke 23:30, Jesus uses that for the destruction of Rome as well. When it comes in and destroys Jerusalem, he says, if they do these things in the green wood, what will they do in the dry? And he tells them to weep for this coming. And they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. All right, even the who can stand, even though that fits in very well with what's being said, again, this is language that we see used this way. So Nahum 1:6, burden against Nineveh. So this is against Assyria. And it talks about the mountains quaking there and who can stand before his indignation. And then Malachi uses the same kind of language to talk about the day of the Messiah coming and establishing his kingdom, and who would be able to stand before him and before his messenger. So, very common language. So, what's the conclusion? Is this inappropriate language? No, it really is fitting because it is the end of the world for some nation, for some empire, for some people. It doesn't matter that there might be other nations or other empires that will continue to exist after that. That won't do them any good. It'll be the end of the world for them and everything that they know, and everything will be changed. So it's very fitting, but all of this is language that is hyperbole, but it's all pointing for the day where it becomes understatement. It will still be a figure, it will still be a symbol, but it's going to transition from hyperbole to understatement. When the real end of the world comes, this will pale. All right, so this fits very well into the context. Remember, what was the question in the fifth seal? How long? Holy and true until you avenge. And so here's the answer. It doesn't answer the how long, but I am going to avenge, and this is what it's going to look like. So it deals with the question that they're asking. Now, if we say, well, is this really the end of the world? Could it be the end of the world? If we consider that possibility, then that doesn't remotely answer the question that the people asked in the fifth seal. How long, holy and true? Well, 2,000 years later, and it still hasn't happened. So that's not an answer. That's not a comfort if it still hasn't happened. They're concerned about what happened to them and what's happening to their brethren. So it has to be something that is imminent. The other thing is what we're about to be looking at in chapter 7 also deals with an impending doom. And again, it doesn't make any sense if we think of this being pointing towards the end of the world. The scenes in chapter 7, trying not to spoil it, are not going to make any sense as well. So the other thing that jumps out is just kind of an inherent incompatibility or a conflict, if you will. When the end of the world does come, we're told in 1 Thessalonians 5 as well as 2 Peter 3 that it's going to come suddenly like a thief in the night. There is not going to be time to say, rocks fall on us, mountains cover us. We're not going to have time to go try to crawl into a hole and try to make it and find some way to survive. We're told in 1 Corinthians 15 that this is going to be something that happens in the blink of an eye. So at least the transformation of the bodies, and there's not going to be the time to react to this. So this is not something that is even appropriate in as far as the specific reaction that's shown here. Now, might people feel that way? Yes, that will be the emotional reaction. They would rather the worst possible things happen to them than to have to face what's coming next. But specifically asking for these things is not possible. All right, any questions about this before we close out chapter 6 and the first 6 seals? Comments? All right, we're going to continue to see that kind of language as we go throughout Revelation. So make sure you kind of hang on to those passages because we're going to come to those over and over again. All right, the next scene is going to be, we've kind of unleashed, if you will, these agents, this plan for judgment. And now the concern is well, what about God's people? How is this going to affect them? Yes, we're answering the question of those that have been slain, but what about those who haven't been slain, that are still here on the earth? What's going to happen to them? So Revelation 7 is going to focus on what's going to happen to them and their protection. So, chapter 7, verse 1, after these things I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, or the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. All right, I guess I kind of already let the cat out of the bag. What is suggested by the imagery of the 4 angels holding back the 4 winds of the earth?
Seems like they're kind of like, since they're holding back the winds, they're kind of protecting the earth from the like complete destruction.
All right, very good. So, and they want to seal the Christians first. They want to seal the servants of God. So, just kind of tearing the symbol apart. 4, we've talked about this before. This is the idea of the world number. You can think of the 4 parts of the compass, north, east, south, and west. Daniel 8 is one of the first places where I think you see this, where it's used for the kind of the 4 directions of the earth. And but Jesus uses the same language in Mark 13:27 about gathering up Christians from the 4 winds, and or the 4 corners, from the farthest part of the earth to the farthest part of the heaven. So you see the same language there. I think you can think about like a map, maybe also the 4 corners of it, kind of representing everything that's known. So the idea is that from the remotest parts, we have this wind that's kind of being held back at the very edges, but when it's let go, it's going to come in and it's going to cover everything. It's going to cover the whole map. So, so these winds are going to be some kind of something under God's control, and it's something that's just kind of hanging there, just waiting to be unleashed. And it's ready to be done, but they have something to take care of first. So I think already you get the hint that these winds are going to be negative. Otherwise, why do we care about sealing God's people first and putting the mark on their foreheads and providing that? So just thinking briefly about the winds, I have several verses here. I'm leaving this for you all to go look at later, just because we don't have time to go into this kind of detail now. So the winds, as we said before, represent, especially these 4 winds, represent the remotest reaches, the corners of the world. Sometimes wind brings blessing. It brings salvation. Think about Numbers 11, where the quail were brought in. Ezekiel 37:9 also. I just went blank. I can't recall that one to mind. But oh well. So sometimes it brings blessing or salvation. Oftentimes it brings some judgment. Ezekiel 17 as well as 19 as well. You have Israel being compared to a vine that gets withered and dried out as an act of judgment, and God uses the wind. Did you look up 37:9?
The dry bones.
Ah, yes, the valley of the dry bones. So the 4 winds come in and they breathe life into the dry bones, which represents Israel and God bringing them out of captivity and reestablishing them. I think maybe some messianic connotations there as well. So an example of where those winds can do good things, but for the most part, we see them being judgment. Often used like a tornado or a whirlwind. Sometimes the wind carries people away like chaff and scatters them. And the other thing that's also kind of pointed out, and this, I think it's a very fitting symbol. The wind, who can control it? Nobody. Who can even see it? I mean, we don't even see the wind. We see its effects. We see the things that it moves and it stirs. But it's something that's unseen. It's out of our control. It's something that lies in God's realm of control. So these are the possibilities. Wind could be these different things. Could be positive. Could be negative. It's definitely not blessing because the saints are being spared from it. We're not talking about scattering because this is coming from the remote corners and it's coming in. So it's going the wrong direction. It's not driving them to the 4 winds. So the wind in this case is being used, I think, very obviously that he talks about harming the earth and the sea and the trees. So this is a very negative connotation. It's referring to judgment that is pent up, but it's being held back. It's waiting on something. So let's talk about what it's waiting on. He says, not to harm till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. So why would they wait until God's people were sealed? What's the idea of the sealing here?
So they can be like easily identified and not destroyed in the judgment that's coming.
Right, very good. So one of the things, by kind of a contrast in the parable of the tares, one of the reasons why he doesn't let judgment fall immediately is because they might grab the wrong one. And so, so that you might tear up, you might actually harvest the wheat with the tares, and then vice versa. The idea of making this distinction, making sure that these people are known and identified, is ultimately for the purpose of protecting them, but it's also a very, I think, important and encouraging note as well, because it shows that God sees us, He knows us, He's made a distinction, and He's taking care of us individually. So the idea that each one of these people are numbered and known is a very encouraging thing. So in Exodus 8, when in the 10 plagues, he says, talking about the swarm of flies, he says, I will set apart the land of Goshen in which my people dwell, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall be. So I think there's a couple things. Again, it tells us something about God, but then it tells us how God feels about us and how He thinks about us as well. So it helps us see these qualities as far as what He sees and knows, but it also shows us our place as well. All right, so before I dig into that too much more, how does this relate to the message that we see in Ezekiel 9? How is it similar? How is it different? And what lessons can we draw from it to help us better understand Revelation 7?
In Ezekiel 9, the good people are the saints. They are the ones who are mourning over all the bad things that are going on in Jerusalem. And they're marked and set apart before, like in Revelation, judgment comes upon them.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone who's not marked is not spared no matter what.
All right, very good. So I think is very similar, just like we saw how Revelation 4 ties very closely to Ezekiel 1, and then even parts of 9 and 10. And then how we saw like the four horsemen, they tie so closely to the animals that we see of different color. The horses of different color in Zechariah 1, and then was it Zechariah 6, I think is the other one. There are certain things where, yes, we're getting bits and pieces, small images, but there's some things that tie very closely to huge pieces. Certainly where we saw chapter 4 and 5 tying so closely to Daniel 2 and 7. So this is another one of those cases where we tie back to a symbol, a large section, and we're getting a lot of meaning from there. So in Ezekiel 9, if you actually back up to Ezekiel 8, he is shown by God supernaturally the grotesque sins that the elders, the leaders of the people are doing in private. Nobody knows about it. And so he allows Ezekiel to dig through the walls and see what they're doing where they think nobody can see them. So that happens in chapter 8. And then in chapter 9, of course, he's doing that to explain part of why chapter 9 is happening. Then he called out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. These would be some kind of angel, some kind of agent under God's control here. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. To the others he said in my hearing, go after him throughout the city and kill. Do not let your eye spare, nor have any pity. So one's going in front, making identification. If someone doesn't get identified, then the ones that are coming behind are executing judgment. utterly slay old and young men, maidens and little children and women. But do not come near anyone on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So again, the thing that we keep stressing, where does judgment begin? With the people of God. At the temple of God is where judgment always begins. So they begin at the temple, and just then the man clothed with linen, who had an inkhorn in his side, reported back and said, I have done as you commanded me. So I think there's several big lessons here. So just for context again, as soon as this finishes, the judgment begins, and one of the people with the battle axe kills one of the elders right there in front of Ezekiel. And Ezekiel exclaims in horror and prays for God not to bring this judgment and to have mercy. And so God continues to explain about his judgment that's coming. So this is something that would shortly begin right behind this. So there's a few lessons I think we pull from this. First of all, as I said earlier, God sees, he knows. This is not something that's hasty, that's uncontrolled. I don't know if you ever had occasion where your parents maybe got upset at all the siblings, and maybe some of them got disciplined that didn't necessarily need it because the parents were just frazzled and worn out. This is not happening here. This is somebody who's entirely in control, and everything is being meted out with justice, and he knows who is deserving and who is not. So he knows his people. He makes a distinction. Can't help but think of 2 Timothy 2:19. Again, the solid foundation of God stands, having the seal. The Lord knows those who are his, and let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. Several good references to that here also in 1 Kings 19 and Isaiah 40 as well. So one of the things that I think is important for us to think about as far as application is, are we like the people in Ezekiel 9? Are we sighing and crying over the abominations? These are the people that are marked out. Or is this something that we're okay with? And again, like the elders that are back in Ezekiel 8, in the privacy of our own home and other places, are we partaking in those things? Even if nobody sees or knows, or we think nobody sees or knows, God knows. And those are the people that judgment actually began with, them first. Because they were in those positions of prominence, and because they were supposed to be doing something else more, again, to whom more is given, more is expected. And then in Isaiah 40, verses 26 and 27, the same kind of phrasing is used there. And there the people say that my way is hidden from God. And so is that part of our motivation? Again, thinking that no one sees or knows. Now, ironically, the people there in Isaiah 40, part of it's judgment, but part of the reason they're asking is also out of discouragement. They think that God has lost track of them. So again, I think this is something that's very helpful in understanding that it can be either a message that's very encouraging. I feel like God doesn't know. I've been forgotten. I've been left behind. No, God sees. God knows. But at the same time, it's a message of warning. God doesn't see. He doesn't know what I'm doing. Yes, no, he absolutely does. So Numbers 32:23, I love what Moses said here. He says, take note, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. So the idea that we may think we've gotten by with it for a little bit, but eventually this is something that will catch up to us, and the consequences will come. And so, as David said, cleanse us from our secret sins. Let's make those right. Let's stop doing those and make sure that when this kind of judgment comes, it will not find us, much less quickly. So, the other thing can't help but think of, remember Lot made a lot of mistakes, but in 2 Peter 2, he's described as being righteous. And part of the things that's highlighted there is the fact that his soul was vexed daily. And so again, this is a picture of someone who's, for whatever reason, maybe it's partly his own choosing, maybe it's partly out of his control, but he is in a position where he is surrounded by sin, and not only is he not partaking in it, but he's vexed by it. And if we go back to the original text, he's even speaking out against it. And apparently he had done so more than once, because they were ready just to kill him, because they had this reputation of someone who was always judging them. So are we being like Lot in this case, in this good way? sighing and crying over this. And then lastly, I did as you commanded. What we see here is not the ideal, it's not, this is it. This is how it is going to be executed. It will not fail. So last thing, so does this mean that we won't ever suffer consequences of bad things with the bad people that are around us? No. And that is part of, I think, the lesson of Revelation. At the end of the day, when this kind of doom falls, it falls on everybody. It falls on the good people and it falls on the bad people just the same. The difference is in two things. What happens next is very different for both parties. The other thing is how we react to that judgment. In the midst of such kind of judgment, when this kind of world comes to an end, the Christian can still stand strong and can still be optimistic, can still be faithful, and can exhibit a confidence and a courage that the world cannot do. And so they can be a source of light and direction for those that are left behind. But for those who that was their world, it becomes the end of their world. And they have no hope. They have no light. It does become utter darkness for them. So what is a form of suffering, the Christian is able to kind of slough off, if you will. They're able to look past it. So think about 2 Corinthians 4 and 5. The outward man is decaying, crumbling away. But we're focused on where we're going. The inward man is being renewed day by day. The people of the world do not have such a thing. Their world just continues to crumble. So we can be an example to them and avoid the suffering that comes with that they cannot avoid. And then, of course, God's going to ultimately make this right in eternal judgment. So, again, pointing to that as well. And then also we will see kind of a third case. There are some forms of judgment that happen even in this world that do not happen to God's people. And there will be other forms that only happen to those who are unrestrained. All right. Any questions, thoughts on this so far? I know I'm kind of flying through this and monologuing.
I was thinking about the point you made about the angels and how they perform God's will.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminded me of the prayer that Jesus taught, that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And we see these pictures just how immediate and complete God's will is performed in heaven. That's how we should be trying to perform it.
Yeah, very good. So if we're His servants, that's what we're going to be doing. And that's a good point. I want to actually come back to that here in a bit. Okay, so he goes on in verse 4 here of chapter 7. I heard the number of those who were sealed. 144,000 of all the tribes of the children of Israel were sealed. By the way, this is where the Jehovah's Witness, this is where they get their picture of there only being 144,000 that are going to be saved in heaven. This is where that comes from. Of the tribe of Judah, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Reuben, 12,000 were sealed. Of the tribe of Gad, 12,000 were sealed. And so on and so forth until we get to Benjamin, 12,000 were sealed. So what does Israel represent in this chapter? And what is the significance of the 144,000?
It's the people of God.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of passages come to mind thinking about Israel representing God's spiritual people. Really, all of Israel, all the Old Testament stands as a figure in this case where Israel was the people of God, but physically. All right, ideally spiritually as well, but ultimately spiritually. So Romans 2 talks about one who's not a Jew inwardly, not a Jew just outwardly, but also one inwardly. Chapter 9 talks about not all of Israel who are of Israel. So there being a distinction between kind of true Israel, God's people, and those that are just Israel by birth. And Galatians 6:16 talks about the Israel of God as well, applying to the church. So the 12 tribes, we've seen these passages before, Matthew 19:28 and Luke 22:30 about the 12 apostles sitting on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Again, very clear reference, a necessary reference to the church, but yet calling it Israel. So 144,000, remember 12, what's the original appearance, the first appearance of the symbol? It's going to be the 12 tribes, the 12 sons of Jacob. This is all of God's people. So multiplied by itself, we're emphasizing it, and then times 10, times 10, times 10, so 3 tens. Again, if 10 is the extent, the full extent of people, And we have that 3 times. Then we have all of God's people emphasized and entirely and complete. So all of God's people everywhere throughout the entire earth, no one is overlooked. Everybody is considered. So Matthew 10:28 through 31, remember, not a sparrow falls without him seeing it and knowing it. And then he says, well, of how much more value are you? So if God has numbered all of our hairs and sees the fall of every sparrow, how much more does he see each of us individually as well? So why not, if you look at the list, Dan and Ephraim are missing. We don't know exactly why. He doesn't actually explain it, but I think some good possibilities is, if you think about Jeroboam rebelling against Solomon, he was from the tribe of Ephraim. And in fact, Ephraim would continue to be, the northern kingdom would be called Ephraim over and over and over again. By population, they were the dominant tribe. And so they become, I think, a representation of rebellion, but idolatry. He also set up the golden calves where? Dan and Bethel. So Judges 18, the people of Dan were the most corrupt that are also brought before us as well. So I think the lesson here is in numbering those who are rebellious, those who are corrupt, those who are idolatrous, they are not included. So again, there's this kind of subtle lesson here, this subtle reminder. This is not something we're born into. This is not something that's kind of a once saved, always saved. We have to make sure that we keep ourselves clean and pure. Here's an example of some of God's people who were omitted because of their behavior. Interesting, Judah is at the front. This kind of makes sense. Remember how Jacob or how Israel blessed his sons? Judah was the one who received the spiritual blessing. It was going to be the one that the king was going to come through. The scepter would not depart until Shiloh comes, and that he would be above his brethren. So we see that playing out here in the not only the leading, like the ordering, but also the fact that Jesus is obviously the Messiah. He came from the tribe of Judah. All right, so let's go into these last few verses where we see kind of this eternal home and paradise that's presented before us. So how is the host described here, and what might be the significance of the palm branches? So first, the easy one. What do we see? What's the description?
It's a great multitude from every nation.
And what's their condition? What kind of conditions are they in?
White robes.
White robes?
Before the throne.
Before the throne. All right, very good. And we see them with the palm branches. So he looks a great multitude, no one can number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb. So there's a couple of things. This last part is there's several parts in Revelation I struggle with, just some more than others. And this is one of the ones where I struggle with the exact significance of this. Obviously, this is supposed to be a symbol of reassurance. This is what awaits God's people. This is the comfort that he offers. He's taking care of them. That's the whole point of this scene. He knows all of his people. He's taking care of them. But there's a few things here I don't know exactly what this is referring to, what point in time it's referring to. So remember, we numbered 144,000, but now these people are innumerable. So I think that says that we're at least past Earth. We're looking at something beyond this place where all the people of God are known and numbered, because this is innumerable. This is something that I think is probably either referring to heaven or maybe referring to paradise, the condition of the people that have died but maybe not yet gone to heaven. So as you're kind of gathering things up, I want to mention the palm branches. This goes back to the Feast of Tabernacles, which is, he says in Leviticus 23, is supposed to remind them of when they were in the wilderness, when God was taking care of them. So think about if you were trying to survive, whether it's a video game, a zombie apocalypse, or just whatever, you would build a big fort, right? The biggest, strongest, most powerful structure. And this is the exact opposite. I want you to make a tent out of the most beautiful and flimsy and lightweight palm branches and flowering branches you can find. Why? Because God is there. God is taking care of you. You have no need of a fort. You have no need of protection. God is your protection. That was the whole point of the Feast of Tabernacles, was they were living in these flimsy booths, these flimsy tents made out of palm branches, to remind them that God is their defense. He is their fortress. And they don't have worry of anything else. And it was supposed to be a feast of joy and something they were going to be very happy about. And so this takes us back to victory, to joy, beauty, but also security and dependence. It's almost like a childlike state where we don't have to worry about anything. God is taking care of us. And so this is the condition of these people with their palm branches as well. All right, thank you all. Thank you for staying a little bit longer. We'll pick up with the next question next time and then try to very quickly move into the next chapter. Thank you all.